The Fangen. Long ago, a little boy lived deep in the Bavarian Alps. He lived with his parents in a small village in the middle of a lonely valley. One day, he got into a fierce argument with them. Filled with anger and defiance, he stormed out of the house and decided never to return. For hours, he wandered through the dense forests of the Bavarian Alps. The tall trees stood close together, and their shadows grew longer with every passing hour. Before long, the boy no longer knew where he was. He had become hopelessly lost. As dusk fell and the last rays of sunlight shone between the tree trunks, he sank to the ground in exhaustion. Leaning against a large tree, he pulled his knees to his chest and began to cry bitterly. Now he regretted running away from home. His anger had vanished, but his fear remained. All alone in the middle of the forest, he had no idea how to find his way back home. Suddenly he heard a rustling sound behind him. Then came the cracking of branches, as if someone, or something, was moving among the trees. Trembling, the boy peeked around the tree trunk to see what was there. When he realized who, or what, was approaching, his heart nearly stopped with terror. A short distance behind him, the boy saw a group of eerie figures emerging between the trees. He had heard stories about these beings many times before. On certain evenings in the village, the adults would tell tales of them to frighten the children. Now those terrifying creatures stood before his very eyes. They were called the Fangen. Their dark, gnarled bodies seemed to be made of wood, roots, bark, and moss. They looked like living trees that had risen from the forest floor. Long, tangled strands of grass, lichen, and plant matter hung from them like wild hair and shaggy beards. Hidden among these masses, their horrifying faces could only be seen faintly. Deep, dark eye sockets stared out from the shadows, and their wide-open mouths looked as though they might unleash a dreadful howl at any moment. Their long, powerful arms swung back and forth as they walked. At the ends of those arms were enormous hands that resembled the twisted roots of ancient trees. The garments of the Fangen were made of bark, moss, animal pelts, and withered leaves. These garments blended so completely with their bodies that it was almost impossible to tell where the creature ended and its clothing began. The Fangen drew ever closer through the dark forest. One of the Fangen suddenly noticed the boy peeking fearfully from behind the tree. Instantly, the eerie creature stopped and fixed its grim gaze upon him. Then the Fang let out a harsh, frightening growl and began moving toward him with enormous strides. The moment the boy realized he had been discovered, sheer terror seized him. He leapt to his feet and ran as fast as he could down the steep forest slope. As he ran, he screamed for help and cried in fear. His cries echoed among the dark trees, but no one heard them. Deep within the lonely forests of the Bavarian Alps, there was not another person anywhere nearby. Desperately, the boy kept running. Branches whipped against his face, and his feet stumbled over roots and stones. Behind him, however, the Fang drew ever nearer. The creature was far larger and much faster than he was. With its long legs, it effortlessly overcame every obstacle in its path. Before long, the Fang caught up with him. With one enormous root-like hand, it grabbed the boy by his shirt. The boy screamed, but it did no good. The Fang lifted him as though he weighed nothing and carried him back to the other Fangen waiting among the dark trees. At once, the other Fangen formed a tight circle around the boy. Terrified and panicked, he screamed and cried without ceasing, but the eerie beings paid no attention. Curious, they bent down toward their captive. With their long, root-like fingers, they examined him. They turned him this way and that, studying his face, his clothing, his small hands, and his entire body. As they did so, they emitted rough, creaking sounds that resembled branches striking against one another during a storm. After observing him for a long time, the creatures seemed to reach an agreement. The Fang who had captured the boy dragged him deeper into the forest while the others followed. There, at a certain spot, stood a special tree trunk, old and carefully chosen by the creatures. Whenever the Fangen wished to play one of their favorite games with human captives, they brought them to this tree. This cruel game was known among them as the rubbing game. The Fang who had captured the boy dragged him to the selected tree trunk, pressed him against it with tremendous force, and began rubbing his body against the rough wood. The boy cried out in pain and begged them to stop, but the Fang ignored his pleas, as did all the others. Curious and fascinated, the Fangen watched the so-called rubbing game. The boy was rubbed mercilessly against the trunk. Blood eventually spurted and sprayed around the tree like a fine spray of rain as the boy's skin was rubbed away. Eventually the bones were reached, then the flesh, the organs. His entire body was gradually worn away. The boy screamed again and again in unbearable agony and mortal terror. His cries grew louder and louder until, after some time, his strength finally faded and death mercifully claimed him. But even then, the fang did not stop rubbing the lifeless body against the tree trunk until almost nothing remained. Only a few mortal remains of the boy were left upon the forest floor before the tree. The fangen lingered there for a while longer. Then they turned away and disappeared deeper into the forest of the Alps, shrieking and creaking as they went. The next day, the boy's parents searched through that part of the Bavarian forests. Ever since his disappearance, they had looked for him without rest. Despite their fear, they still clung to the hope of finding their son alive. Hour after hour, they wandered through the alpine woods calling his name. Eventually, they reached the place where the great tree trunk stood, its bark stained reddish with blood. At once, they realized that something terrible had happened there. Around the tree, they found the few mortal remains of their son, torn scraps of clothing, scattered bone fragments, pieces of flesh and organs, all grim remnants bearing witness to his tragic end. The parents knew the old stories of the fangen. Immediately, they understood the cruel fate that had befallen their child. Overwhelmed with grief, they collapsed and wept bitterly. For a long time, they remained there before finally returning to the village. There they obtained a sack to gather what remained of their son, so that he could be buried in the village. They also made a simple wooden cross. Together with 2 candles, they placed it beside the tree in memory of their lost child. For a long time they mourned there in the forest, embracing one another and weeping together until at last they began the journey home with broken hearts. Later, the story continued to be told throughout the village. The children were warned more urgently than ever never to wander alone into the deep forests of the Alps, lest a similar fate should one day befall them.